You're listening to Radio Maria, a Christian voice in your home. We now present our program, Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism, with Roy Showman.
Hi, this is Roy Showman, and welcome again to Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism, the show on Radio Maria that celebrates the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church, or seen the other way around, that celebrates the completion, the fulfillment, the full realization of the promise of Judaism in the Catholic Church and its sacraments. Now, today's show is a little bit different. It's a little bit of an experiment because it's actually the second part of a two-part show. I began last week talking about one of the major figures in Jewish Catholic conversion, so to speak, of the 19th century, Theodore Ratisbonne, and I only got about halfway through his life. So I promised at the end of the show last week to continue with the rest of his story this week, because it's such a beautiful story. I did not want to sell it short. However, I obviously want to give a little bit of a recap for those listeners who didn't listen last week, but not doing it really full justice. So if you didn't hear last week's show, you might want to go back and listen to the archived version on radiomaria.us. I believe it was the May 27th show of Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism. Theodore Ratisbonne, first of all, very briefly, why he's so notable is not only was he a very dramatic convert from Judaism to Catholicism and became a priest, but he also started a religious congregation, the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion, in the Holy Land with the express purpose of praying for the conversion of the Jews. And he very much saw the need to pray for the conversion of the Jews and the conversion of the Jews to be a sign of the times leading up to the second coming. In other words, that the time for the conversion of the Jews was upon us. And as we know, nowadays we know from the New Catechism of the Catholic Church, but it in fact was a teaching from the days of the Church Fathers that the second coming would have to be preceded by a large-scale conversion of the Jews. The New Catechism states in paragraph 674, quote, "The glorious Messiah's coming is suspended at every moment of history until his recognition by all Israel." In other words, until there is a widespread, perhaps not universal, but notable conversion of the Jews. And Theodore Ratisbonne and his brother, Alphonse Ratisbonne, who had an even more miraculous conversion from atheistic Judaism to Catholicism and then the priesthood, together founded this congregation to help facilitate that, to pray for the conversion of the Jews. So that's one reason why he's such a notable figure. So he was born a very wealthy aristocratic Jew in France, in Strasbourg in northeastern France in 1802. As a child, he had a very sensitive, pious nature. The family put him on a career path of banking, which was kind of the family business. They were very wealthy banking family. He was bored to tears and hated it, and wanted anything but to continue on that career of banking. He felt the presence of God and felt very seriously about God, given his pious nature, but he was turned off by Judaism. As he said, religion was very repugnant to me, my own and all other religions. I won't start bad-mouthing or relating what he found distasteful in Judaism, but he didn't find God there. He didn't feel he found God there. The only place he found solace and where he went to find God was beautiful places in nature. But he was in a very, very deep sadness in this kind of longing for God and not knowing where to find him, and not feeling the need to have a real meaning to life, but did not know the meaning of life. So he started reading philosophy, reading all of the notable philosophers to try to find the meaning of life. He was kind of fixated on the problem of good and evil and the existence of suffering given God's omnipotence. In other words, how to reconcile the prevalence of suffering in human life with the all-powerfulness and all-goodness of God. A classic, very serious problem, if I may say so, to which no one has an answer like the Catholic Church has the answer. Anyway, he while he was in law school, a friend of his, another Jewish friend of his, in fact, suggested that he take a philosophy course, and he did take a philosophy course. The teacher was a Mr. Boutin, I believe, and he was a fervent Christian, Catholic, but he did not mention religion in his philosophy course, but he did talk about absolute truth, about man's moral situation, his moral degradation versus his urge towards virtue, and so forth. Now, Theodore Ratisbonne at this point is in his very late teens or early 20s, and now I will turn to his words, that is Theodore Ratisbonne's words, about the experience he had in this philosophy course of Mr. Boutin. The conviction of his interesting and brilliant lectures drove away, without any resistance on my part, the darkness which my indiscriminate reading had accumulated in my mind. Not only did the lectures enlighten my intelligence, but they filled my soul with warmth, joy, and peace. The scales fell from my eyes, and I caught a glimpse of the light of truth. I saw man as he is and as he is meant to be. I understood that man is no longer as he was when he came from the hands of God. On the one hand, psychology shows us the admirable scope, the harmony, the order of importance of human faculties. However, the reality of history shows us that a profound alteration has taken place in these faculties. Man's moral degradation is an indisputable fact, and I was no longer surprised to find areas of darkness within myself and around me. But how can one explain this general decadence except through an initial fall? The idea of reparation through sacrifice and other truths of religion flowed naturally and logically from this doctrine. This was Christianity in its most ideal form, without any theological formulas. Without being aware of it, my soul was being nourished on Christian teaching, and I did not know that under the guise of this enlightening philosophy which gave me such joy, religion was to be found. Without any consciousness on my part, I was enveloped and penetrated by this divine light. I think I would never have had the courage to come face to face with Christianity. I had to some extent become a Christian without knowing it. I had found the way to the truth which I had sought so much, and on which I had called so often, and I finally caught a glimpse of the goal of my life, to which all my desires and thoughts were directed. This superior goal was no longer a mystery to me. It seemed as attainable as light is to a man who is willing to open his eyes, and I could not understand the thoughtlessness of those who accept this truth and yet take part in the amusements of the children of this world, forgetting that life on earth is a passing thing, a roadway which leads to a sublime end. But how shall I explain the struggles which I had to face with my childhood prejudices, my memories, my instinctive attachment to the thing I called the religion of my fathers? I was not sufficiently educated to see the link between Judaism and Christianity. I thought they were two different religions, and that the God of Abraham was not the God of Christians. I was afraid of studying this question at a deeper level, and yet I had a profound belief in the Blessed Trinity without knowing the theological formula for this sacred dogma. So we see here that basically Theodore Ratisbonne's consideration of man proceeding created by the hand of God contrasted with the state of fallen man today, invited the conclusion of original sin, invited the conclusion of the fall of man, gave it a kind of visceral, intuitive truth and certainty to it, and that basically the examination of these philosophical questions in the context of the search for truth in itself already implicitly brought him to Christianity, even though Christianity was per se never mentioned in the course and was not an explicit goal of the course. This reminds me, there's a very notable philosopher still living, although she's in her mid-90s, Alice von Hildebrand, who taught for, I believe, about 20 years at Hunter College. She taught philosophy. She was scrupulous in not mentioning religion. She would have probably been fired on the spot if she had mentioned anything having to do with religion. And yet she had at least dozens of her students, many of whom were Jewish and many of whom were atheistic Jews, who found the truth of Catholicism through her course, through her lectures, simply by being presented with the Catholic truths of philosophy, so to speak, in their sanitary, non-religious context, but still the evidence of the objective nature of truth just led them, basically, as Ratisbonne said, the scales fell from their eyes and they entered the church. And I have, in fact, recounted the conversion stories of some of those students of Alice von Hildebrand, some of those Jewish students of Alice von Hildebrand, and 2 or 3 of them have their witness testimonies in my book, Honey from the Rock. So this is, of course, a much earlier case of it, but it was a case in which simply the presentation of philosophical truth brought young Theodore Ratisbonne to the truths of Christianity, and even the truth of the Most Holy Trinity without it ever being explicitly mentioned. And now we will turn to his explanation of how he concluded in the truth of the Most Holy Trinity through, in some sense, sheer logic, without any kind of revealed religion catechesis. The ideal was revealed to me in a single phrase: God is love. This evangelical word gave warmth to my heart and light to my mind. It seemed to me to contain the key to knowledge. In the love of God, I saw a foreshadowing of the mystery of the Trinity, the mystery of creation, and the reason for all the acts of our redemption. Eternal love being love, by his very nature and substance begot eternal love. What could he have loved before he created beings? Obviously, he loved himself. This means that divinity consisted of a lover and a loved one. But between these two objects, there was a continual flow of life, of communication, and of love, which constitutes the third term and which completes, as it were, the perfect accord. These vague and imperfect ideas satisfied my thirst for knowledge, and I was glad to see that Christians do not adore 3 gods, the chief question that keeps Jews from Christianity. So you see here that Ratisbonne was led to the belief or the conclusion of God as Trinity simply from the starting point that God is love. Because if God is love, what did God love before he created any beings, before there were any created beings? Obviously, he loved himself, which means that divinity consists of a lover and a loved one. And between these two objects, there was a flow of life, of communication, and of love. And this flow of love in itself, being within the Godhead, being within God and part of God, constituted a third agent, let's say, a third person, which is the Holy Spirit. This being the eve of Pentecost, it is a wonderful thing to dwell on, but I think it's unspeakably beautiful that the starting point of God being love can in itself lead to the belief in the triune nature of God. Anyway, back to Theodore Ratisbonne. So my intention, I did read some of this text already last week. My intention was not to read parts of his memoirs that I already read, but simply to use it as a springboard to new writings of his. So anyway, there's a few more paragraphs that overlap with last week, but then we'll get to new material. The creation of man and of the firmament also became comprehensible to me. An all-powerful love would of necessity have grandiose plans, and it is easy to understand that he would create many beings to make them happy. All the acts of the redemption, all the mysteries of religion follow logically from these primary truths. If some parts of this luminous picture were still hidden from me, I did not add to the darkness by objecting presumptuously. So now the question is, what made him cross the Rubicon, so to speak, and bring him to Christianity per se? And the answer is that he had fallen ill in a Swiss hotel, and actually in his illness thought he was going to die. Now I will turn to his words. I fell into depression, and at that decisive moment I did not know what God to call upon. The vagueness of my philosophical beliefs left me a prey to terrible uncertainty, and within me there was an immense struggle between my childhood prejudices and my new faith. I dared not pray for fear of offending the God of Abraham by praying to the God of the Christians. It was a fierce battle, but grace won the day. From my lips and my heart, the name of Jesus Christ came as a cry of distress. It was evening, and the following day I was so much better that I was able to leave Geneva, where I was just passing through. I was so comforted by my invocation of Jesus Christ that I wanted to continue praying. To provide nourishment for my hungry soul, I asked one of the hotel maids to buy me a prayer book. So in very short, what brought him across to full beliefs in Christianity was believing he was at the point of death in this illness. He cried out to Jesus Christ, and he had an immediate recovery, and he was so comforted, as he said, by his invocation of Jesus Christ that he simply wanted to continue praying and asked the chambermaid to get him a Christian prayer book. Back to his words. I began to pray quite simply, straight from the heart, without the help of any book or any human formula. My lips became accustomed to the name of Jesus Christ. I pronounced it confidently, and I also prayed to Mary. I took an ever-growing delight in the teachings of Christianity. I had been completely won over to the faith, but I was not baptized. I had no part in the grace of the sacraments. Mr. Boutin did not put me in contact with any priest. I had no direction, and I did not know how to go about getting baptized. So he is now at the point of being essentially as fully Christian as one could be without being baptized. As he said at this point, no one in his family or outside suspected his leanings to Christianity. He continued with his studies at that point, which centered around law school, and passed the law exams. And he also taught as a volunteer. He taught in a Jewish school, taught Jewish children in a Jewish school. But as he says, his Christian faith was also growing, and more he felt the need of participating in the worship of a living religion. He deplored the limitations of the situation which prevented him from declaring his Christian faith. You have no idea of the thrill of joy which went through me when I secretly assisted at a church feast. I shall never forget my feelings when for the first time I assisted at High Mass, when I heard the singing echoing religiously in my soul like prayer and love, when I raised my timid eyes from the back of the church where I had hidden myself, to see the white-clad priest raise the host to expose the Blessed Sacrament. His white head was enveloped in clouds of incense, and he seemed to me clothed in fire. I did not know where he had come from, nor how he remained in the air. I thought that he was borne up on the cloud of incense. I looked upon him almost as a celestial creature. This was a new experience for me. I had seen Catholic worship in all its pomp. The church alone seemed to me the sole home of those who adored the true God. Okay, so now we see how Christian he had become, still not baptized, And he was at the point in life in his early 20s where it was considered appropriate for him to be matched with a suitable spouse. As I mentioned, he was from a very wealthy aristocratic Jewish family. A match was proposed to him with a very wealthy aristocratic young Jewish woman from Vienna, whose, in his words, name, fortune, and qualities completely dazzled him. He was under a lot of pressure to marry her, and he was very attracted to the idea of marrying her. But as he said, quote, some mysterious power within me counterbalanced my family's insistence and my own desires. I became ill from the struggle. Yet I could not bring myself to make a decision. It was as if I were immobilized by an invisible power. All the members of my family, all my friends reproached me for my inexplicable vacillation. So he was in this paralysis of indecision. He asked the philosophy professor, Mr. Bautin, what he should do. Mr. Bautin's response was, quote, if you marry, you do well. If you do not marry, you do better. And he left him to his indecision. And as he said at that point, sometimes I wanted to do well, sometimes I wanted to do better, and for 3 long months I battled in the midst of the most cruel perplexity. So that is the point of his life and his conversion where we ended last week. So now we will get to the next stage, which brought him out of this perplexity and to a fuller relationship with Christianity, and of course, soon thereafter to the priesthood, to religious life, and to starting this congregation to pray for the conversion of the Jews. Back to the words of Theodore Ratisbonne. By the way, I apologize for not mentioning this at the outset. I am reading from his memoirs, which are available for free in PDF form on my website, salvationisfromthejews.com. So if you go to salvationisfromthejews.com, if you're interested in reading the entire memoirs, which are about 70 or 80 pages, you can go to my website, salvationisfromthejews.com. You can, I believe, go to the section called Articles and Reviews. That's right. And you will see there a link to the memoirs of Father Theodore Ratisbonne, the memoirs, in fact, which I'm reading from right now. So back to this point of his perplexity, his dilemma about whether he should marry or not. Finally, in one of my moments of utter depression, help came from an unexpected source. It was evening, I needed to breathe, and I went out mechanically without noticing where I was going. I was praying silently while directing my steps towards the promenade and raising my eyes to heaven to ask for help. I noticed a brilliant star fall from the heavens and drop in the direction of the street where Miss Human lived. Certainly this was a phenomenon of nature, but it struck me as being a sign from heaven. I immediately changed the direction of my walk and went off to the street pointed out to me by the star. A sudden inspiration urged me to go to Miss Human's. Now, let me interject here. Miss Human was a roommate of Mr. Bautin, or a housemate. They shared a house, or they roomed in the same house. So that's the only contact at this point that Theodore Ratisbonne had with Miss Human was he had encountered her 2 or 3 times total in the context of visiting Mr. Bautin at his home. As he said, I will go back to his own words, I had only seen her 2 or 3 times and had never spoken to her, but I must confess that her honorable and dignified appearance had made a deep impression on me. In spite of the late hour, I went straight to Miss Human's. The latter seemed a little astonished at receiving at this late hour the visit of a distraught young man, a very upset young man, who said to her without any preamble, I have come to ask for advice. I am being urged to leave immediately to contract a marriage, the prospect of which delights me very much, but I cannot make up my mind whether to go or to stay. This worthy Christian woman listened to me with angelic goodness and answered in a tender voice, You must never make a decision when you are troubled. Ask for a 3 months delay, and when you have regained your calmness, you will be able to think more wisely about what decision you should take. These short, simple words produced in me emotions which I simply cannot describe. They were like a breath from heaven, which passed over my heart and dissipated all the clouds. I experienced a peace hitherto unknown. This new feeling filled me with such happiness that it left no room for other feelings. All thought of marriage disappeared like clouds before the sun. No word, no explanation of mine can ever give any idea of the happy days which followed. I lived in the joy and simplicity of God's children, forgetting the past and entrusting the future to divine providence. I will interject that the advice that Miss Humann gave Theodore Ratisbonne, I don't know if she got it from St. Ignatius or not, but it is straight from St. Ignatius. In his spiritual exercises, he talks about discernment of spirits, and the point he makes is that one should never make a life decision in a state of agitation, that the state of agitation itself is a sign of essentially not being in the presence of the Holy Spirit, not being under the influence of the good spirit. When you're under the influence of the good spirit, you're filled with joy and peace and calmness. When you're under the influence of other spirits, you are filled with turmoil and anxiety and so forth. And any life decision should be made in the light of the Holy Spirit, in the light of the good spirit. And the sign that you are in that light is being in a state of peace and calm and joy. So, as you see in this case, the words themselves, just pointing out to him that he should not make a decision in the state he was in, was enough to restore his soul to tranquility and to produce this inflooding of the Holy Spirit, it seems. And at that point, he had actually lost all interest in going forward with the marriage. Through his contact with, going to his words again, through his contact with his spiritual mother, that is, this Miss Humann, I felt my faith growing continually, and I was more than impatient to receive baptism. This grace was indefinitely postponed for fear of the Jews. It was fear that my conversion would provoke an outburst in the synagogue and would compromise the good work I was doing there. At that time, the conversion of a Jew was very rare and almost unheard of. The only way in which baptism could even be considered would be to confer it in absolute secrecy. I do not know what precautions were taken and what arrangements were made, but one day I received a letter from Miss Humann telling me that I would be baptized on April 14th of that year, 1827. It was Holy Saturday. On that day, my most ardent desire was realized. My spiritual mother herself poured the water of regeneration over my head and led me into the church. It was a simple sprinkling carried out without ceremony, without witness, in utter secrecy. No one else knew what had happened in God's sight, not even Mr. Bautin or my friends. I was a Christian. That was all I wanted. I experienced indescribable happiness from my baptism. It was a heavenly experience. I willingly compare it to the emotions felt by a man born blind who gains his sight. It seemed that my dry soul had been washed by a refreshing dew, and I felt great desires grow in me as I prayed. I could not receive other sacramental graces, but I wanted them without knowing what they were, for I had a strong presentiment that there were communications on a deep level between the Master and his disciples. The loving soul, grafted onto Jesus Christ through baptism, feels the need of nourishment for his hungry soul. This hunger for love and union requires a divine object. I did not ask for any explanation of this mystery, and I accepted without any difficulty the word of Christ which revealed this truth. Rational explanations would have weakened rather than justified my faith. Mysteries of love can never be explained to a soul which does not love. The loving soul already feels and tastes the truth in itself without explanation. I longed to receive Holy Communion. A worthy priest, both holy and learned, offered to take me himself to Mayence so that I could make my first communion in secret there. This great grace was granted to me in the bishop's chapel at Mayence, full of the memories of the holy bishop who had died there some years before. I was given the grace of communicating again the following day. The ceremony took place in September on the feast of the Holy Name of Mary. The only witnesses were Mr. Bautin and a Jewish friend of mine who had also come to the truth of Christianity and had been baptized a few months after me. We had to wait some more before receiving the sacrament of confirmation. It is to this grace that my first thoughts of a priestly vocation are attached. The wonderful example of the priest who baptized me the priest who gave me First Communion, added to the inexpressible delights of my First Communion, drew me with increasing attraction to the priesthood. I could think of no other ministry that was more noble, more beautiful. In all my prayers, I asked for the grace to become a priest. I still looked upon the priesthood strictly from the viewpoint of its pastoral functions, and I had no suspicion of how much holiness and education such a sublime vocation demanded. Otherwise, the knowledge of my own shortcomings and of my unworthiness would never have allowed me to undertake this life. But after my baptism, I had become like a little child. I regained the simplicity and gaiety of childhood. So we have followed his conversion to the point where he was baptized, where he received First Communion, where he was received confirmation, and with confirmation started to feel a very strong attraction to the priesthood. So at this point, we've come to the halfway point of the show, a little past, unfortunately, in fact. So I will take a short break. I'll be back in a few minutes.
You're listening to Radio Maria, a Christian voice in your home. We now return to our program, Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism, with Roy Showman.
Hi, welcome back to Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria, the show that celebrates the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church, or the fulfillment, seen the other way around, of Judaism in the Catholic Church and the sacraments. I have been, this show today, giving the reading from the memoirs of a very notable Jewish convert to the Catholic Church, Theodore Ratisbonne. I just got to the point where he had been baptized, received First Holy Communion, was confirmed, and started feeling the grace of a draw to a priestly vocation. I am going to have to really shortchange his witness testimony, of course, in the interest of time. As I mentioned before, if you wish to read his memoirs in their entirety, they're available for free as a PDF file on my website, salvationisfromthejews.com. Under the heading articles and reviews, you'll find it. So anyway, I of course I'm skipping over parts of his witness testimony with brief summaries in the interest of time. And essentially, the next thing that happened was that he was discovered. It was discovered by his family and by the synagogue school, the school for Jewish children, where he was actually volunteering as essentially a catechist, as a teacher. And that caused a tremendous brouhaha and a tremendous confrontation at a meeting that the synagogue held to address the situation. As he said, as Ratisbonne relates it, the meeting was like a solemn funeral. There was a great deal of disturbance at the meeting, and it ended with, as he put it, I got up and, shaking the dust off my feet, I bade an eternal farewell to the synagogue. This moving scene, which I shall never forget, put an end to the complicated situation which had been weighing on me for several years. In getting rid of my shackles, the fulfillment of my vocation became easier. In some ways, it was a preparation for the priestly ministry. It was also to open the doors of Christianity to many souls. The mission which I had carried out with so much love and with which I had just broken with a shattered heart had left me with a burning desire to bring enlightenment to the Jews. I would need pages and pages to describe the temptations and steps of every kind undertaken without end to divert me from my vocation. But this vocation had a solid grip on me. I remember that one day my old uncle, in a moment of despair, told me that he would rather see me cut into 1,000 pieces than to see me wear a cassock. I answered him very calmly, "You would not gain anything by that, because if I were cut into 1,000 pieces, each piece would become a priest, and instead of one cassock, you would have 1,000. However, the calm which I showed in the midst of all these painful scenes was only on the surface. I felt that all the fibers of my heart were being torn apart, one after another, but the grace of God was in proportion to the sacrifices. In the midst of my sorrows, I began to experience the delights of a love which became for me a foretaste of the joys of heaven. In these dispositions, I prepared to enter the seminary." The books which I found most interesting to read at the seminary were those which dealt with the conversion of the Jews. All the fathers of the Church after St. Paul positively announced this joyful event. I believed that I was called to cooperate in it. My soul needed to share with the children of Israel the overflowing of peace, of light, and of happiness, which I myself had found in accepting Christian revelation. Perhaps an insignificant incident encouraged my proselytizing spirit. It was a dream which made a deep impression on me as soon as I arrived at the seminary. During my sleep, I dreamt I was in a garden which soon became very crowded with men, women, and children. Were they Christians or Jews? I don't know. Soon they were all surrounding a little hill on which I was sitting. However, I heard a rustling behind, and I turned my head. Leaning on the back of my chair was an old man, clothed in white and with a long white beard. "I am Enoch," he said to me, and I have come to inspire you about what to say. I was deeply moved, and in spite of my natural presumption, I did not dare to open my lips. Then the saintly old man said, "Do not be afraid. You will talk about the mystery of baptism, and I shall whisper to you what to say." I began to preach at length, but so clearly that on awakening I remembered the whole speech, which I was able to write out in its entirety, and I sent it to Miss Human. Although I did not want to attach too much importance to this dream, I have, ever since that night, had a special devotion to the blessed Enoch, and I pray to him every day. Let me interject here that in the Old Testament there are two prophets, Enoch and Elijah, who were taken up to heaven alive, did not die, but were taken up to heaven alive. And the teaching of the Church Fathers, based on some mysterious passages in the book of Revelation, I believe it's in the book of Revelation, are that in the end times, in the final days, Enoch and Elijah will descend from heaven, still alive, and will preach the conversion of the Jews. And so that's the background to this dream that Theodore Ratisbonne had, where Enoch visited him and gave him the words for him to preach. As a matter of fact, one could even imagine, it isn't just an imagination. First of all, naturally, I take this dream very seriously and think it was a real spiritual experience, that it was a prophetic dream, so to speak. And it suggests that Theodore Ratisbonne's mission, his apostolate for the conversion of the Jews, was acted out coming from the spirit of Enoch, that it was a manifestation of the spirit of Enoch acting in him. Continuing with Theodore Ratisbonne's witness testimony. Excuse me, the hesitation is because I'm trying to figure out what to skip, because even with the second show on the topic, I'm not going to. I have to skip around to reach the end. Okay, so I'll skip to 1842, because I've been talking about Theodore Ratisbonne, and some of you who have been following the show for a while or who have read about famous Jewish converts may recognize the last name as one that he shares with Alphonse Ratisbonne, his younger brother, who had an extremely miraculous conversion, also to Catholicism in 1842. So I will skip to 1842, reading Theodore Ratisbonne's memoirs about what had just happened to his younger brother, Alphonse. At the beginning of 1842, there occurred an extraordinary event which suddenly drew a lot of attention to me, something which I had never sought. It was the miraculous conversion of my brother. From the start, this conversion caused a worldwide interest whose echoes fell back on me. For a long time, I had to hide from the crowd of visitors who, impelled by curiosity or piety, wanted to see and hear the brother of the neophyte of Rome. It was evening on February 1st, 1842, the vigil of the Feast of the Purification. Preparations for this feast had kept me in the confessional for an unusually long time. On returning to my room, I was eating supper alone when I noticed that there were several letters for me. I was too tired to read them, and I hurriedly put aside one. I opened it after I had read all the others. It was dated at Rome, and it related the story of what had happened at San Andrea della Frata. My brother himself, that's Alphonse Ratisbonne, added a few excited lines to the end of that letter. I cannot describe my feelings when I read this letter. I could not control my joy, and yet I did not even want to, share the news with anyone, because this conversion so far passed anything I could have wished for. I spent the whole night in a fever of happiness. Now, the conversion that Theodore Ratisbonne is referring to was his agnostic, or atheist actually, Jewish brother, very anti-Catholic. Alphonse was in Rome, still very anti-Catholic, when he stopped in, due to circumstances, at the Church of San Andrea della Frada, and the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to him in what is to this day the only church-approved apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Rome, and he immediately was converted to Catholicism in her presence. That has been the subject of several other shows. I can't go into it now, but it was a very miraculous, very, very beautiful, instantaneous conversion. And then later, after Alphonse was also a Catholic priest and religious, he joined his brother Theodore in starting the congregation in Israel, the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion, to pray for the conversion of the Jews. Back to Theodore Ratisbonne's memoirs. The next morning, I went as usual to say the 7 o'clock Mass. I was to preach since it was a feast of Our Lady, but in spite of my efforts to control my emotion, abundant tears fell on the altar. They thought I was ill and in great pain, so to reassure these compassionate people, I explained to them the cause of my excitement, and I told them in simple words the story of the miraculous conversion. This story aroused a joy-filled attention. It was as though an electric current starting in Rome had set up vibrations in the hearts of this vast congregation, and there and then they intoned the Magnificat. The awakening of Christian sentiments was not immediate, but from that day forward, the church where this took place, the Church of Notre Dame des Victoires, became the center of a religious movement which spread in every direction a confident faith, the spirit of prayer and love for Mary. What touched me most, however, was the bright light that this event cast on the great question of the conversion of the Jews. Mary's visible intervention seemed to me to be an omen of the approaching fulfillment of the promises of great mercy which God reserved for Israel, promises contained in the sacred books of both the Old and the New Testament. This hope, which had dominated my thoughts since the beginning of my vocation, also took possession of my brother from the instant of his conversion. He wrote me a touching letter, which was full of humility, in simple and enthusiastic language. He gave me his own account of the appearance of the Blessed Virgin on the altar at San Andrea della Frada, and while he was prostrate at the feet of the Savior, he tearfully deplored the religious degradation of the ancient people of God, whose blindness seemed to him to be without human hope of cure. But, he added, it is fervent and persevering prayer which will attract grace from heaven and triumph over all resistance. A special work was necessary, one in conformity with the thoughts of the Church, to fulfill the promises of God concerning the conversion of the children of Israel. That special work, of course, was the founding of the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion, and which, as I mentioned, Theodore and Alphonse Ratisbonne did do in the land of Israel to pray for the conversion of the Jews. Oh boy, maybe I have to end there. I'll just end with a little bit of a comment. I hate ending because his words are so beautiful. I'll just, as Theodore Ratisbonne was considering this mission to work for the conversion of the Jews, as he put it, meditating on the words of the Old Testament prophets about the conversion of the Jews, at the feet of the Blessed Virgin, I saw clearly that this work could not be confided to any congregation already in existence. I placed all these cares in the heart of Mary, and of that resulted, of course, in the formation later of the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion. The role of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the conversion of the Jews seems to be central. It's evident in many stories of the conversion of Jews, including my own personal one and certainly Alphonse Ratisbonne's. And it's also very interesting to me that she seems to play a central role in the conversion of Muslims to the Catholic faith. Fulton Sheen prophesied or predicted that when the Muslims converted, it would be through the Blessed Virgin Mary. There was a long-lasting apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Egypt, in a town called, I believe, Zaitoun, Zeitoun. She appeared as a luminous figure over a church there, frequently over a number of months. It might have been a number of years, I don't remember. And hundreds of thousands of Muslims saw her. And of course, it had a huge effect and resulted in many conversions. And we just had the 100th anniversary of Our Lady of Fatima, the apparition of Mary at Fatima. And of course, the name of the town Fatima itself, Fatima, is the name of Muhammad's favored daughter. Fatima itself is very linked to Islam, since the town is named after Muhammad's daughter, through the history of that part of Europe having fallen under Muslim rule for a number of centuries. And so that also results in this kind of inescapable image that the Blessed Virgin Mary stands at the juncture between Islam and the conversion of Muslims to the true church, to the true religion, to, of course, the Catholic Church. So I have to leave you now. It's the end of the hour. I leave you with my encouragement to use this story to pray for the conversion of everyone who does not have hasn't received the grace which those of us who are members of the Catholic Church have received, to pray that all the Jews, that all the Muslims, that all the people wandering in the darkness or partial light of other religions or other versions of religion might come to the blinding fullness of the light of the Catholic Church, all of the truth and all of the joy and all of the peace and all of the answers and all of the consolations and all of the graces of the sacraments, which we, through no merit of our own, have been fortunate enough to find ourselves in a position of benefiting from. So let's not be selfish. Let's spread the faith as much as we can by our encouragement, by our loving others, by our witnessing when we're called upon to do so, and at all times by our prayers, so that when we do get to heaven, we too may find us, surrounded by a crowd of saints, so to speak, of people who have found their way to heaven in tiny part through our intercession, through our actions, through our prayers, as Theodore Ratisbonne recounted in that dream of his in the presence of the prophet Enoch. So with that, I'll leave you for today. You've been listening to Roy Schoeman, with the show The Promised Messiah of Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria. I hope you join us again next week, same time, same place. Bye for now.